Torture can look like this. Or it can look like this. It can look like this. But it can also look like this. Tools of torture can look like this. But they can also look like this. Throughout the world, police and security forces are responding to public demonstrations with violence, inflicting cruel, inhuman, and degrading acts on peaceful protesters using tools classified as standard policing equipment or less lethal. While this gear can play a legitimate role in law enforcement, it can also cause grave injury, especially when used abusively against protesters. The ill treatment of individuals when asserting their right to peacefully protest stands in violation of treaties signed by almost every country in the world. Yet there is no global regulation on the trade in these tools of torture, allowing manufacturers to make millions while people suffer around the world. What can be done to stop this pandemic of abuse?
Amnesty has been working to stop torture since our organisation began. We now want to focus on the torture trade. There are two types of equipment that we're concerned about. One is inherently abusive, has no other purpose than to torture and ill-treat people, and this should be banned. The second type does serve a legitimate function when properly used. Unfortunately, our research around the world shows that routinely it is misused to commit torture and other ill treatment. Therefore, we need global regulation of the torture trade.
On December 10, 1984, the United Nations General Assembly's Resolution 3946 adopted the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, which requires its state parties to prevent acts of torture and other ill treatment in any territory under its jurisdiction. It makes no exception for internal political instability or any other public emergency. Yet almost 40 years later, authorities routinely violate the treaty when confronting protesters as they march for equality, human rights, economic justice, or the future of our planet. Over the past decade, at least 4,800 protesters have been killed as they face a literal barrage of violent and repressive crowd control methods that meet the definition of torture or other ill treatment, yet are still widely practiced. These tactics not only cause grave injury to peaceful protesters, they also have a chilling effect on protest movements as a whole, undermining the positive effects of protests and preventing the people most discriminated against from having a voice. In 2020, scenes of police using excessive tear gas outside the White House shocked the world. But that was only one example of a chemical irritant being used against protesters. French police recklessly deployed tear gas against protesters in September of 2019. That same year, tear gas grenades manufactured by French companies Nobel Sport Sécurité and Alcetex were used abusively against protesters in Lebanon as they marched against widespread corruption. The burning and swelling caused by tear gas isn't the only threat. The canisters themselves pose a danger to the public when fired as projectiles into the crowd. Protesters in Sudan have been directly struck by tear gas grenades made in Brazil, and a woman in Colombia was severely injured when American-made tear gas canisters were fired at low angles during protests that have resulted in an estimated 87 deaths.
These canisters are projectiles. So when they're fired, again, it's into an indiscriminate group of people. They're really hard to direct, impossible to direct, in fact. And so when they hit people, especially in their face or their head, their delicate parts of their neck, that's when you see blunt trauma and death.
In addition to large tear gas projectiles, protesters today also face rubber bullets that are often fired indiscriminately into crowds, sometimes with horrific results.
My son's face is completely disfigured. My son has splinters. They have ruined his life.
Amnesty International has documented the abusive use of rubber bullets against protesters in over 30 states or territories in all regions of the world. Rubber bullets, chemical irritants, and even handheld batons can become tools of torture and other ill treatment when deployed unlawfully against individuals. Without trade controls, these goods often end up in the hands of abusive police forces who use them in crackdowns on peaceful protests. That is why Amnesty International is calling on states to agree to a legally binding global treaty to control the torture trade and protect peaceful protesters. The Torture-Free Trade Treaty should establish strong international standards for the trade in law enforcement tools with a total ban on inherently abusive equipment, including spike batons and shields, certain electric shock devices, and restraints, such as leg irons and wall, thumb, and finger cuffs. The treaty should also call for human rights-based controls on tools that law enforcement officials ordinarily have access to. Protest has played a vital role in making sure our human rights are acknowledged by institutions with power. Until these tools of torture are regulated, protesters will continue to face violent repression that undermines these fundamental rights.